I'm pretty sure there are two types of dog owners, the ones that let their dogs sleep in the bed with them, and then there are the ones like us that would really rather him not, but every morning when we wake up, Tucker has curled himself up right at our feet, and honestly, he's just too cute to say no to. Thank goodness for the Coat Defense Daily Preventative Powder. This powder is so easy to use. Tucker loves it. It acts as a dry shampoo and it actually repels dirt and eliminates odors. So Tucker stays so much more clean and fresh since we started using it. You can visit coatdefense.com and receive 15% off your purchase with the code MAMA15. Believe me, you will notice a difference and just maybe you'll let your furry friend climb up on the bed every once in a while. Drew Hammer has lived a fascinating life, no doubt, from marrying into the Armie Hammer dynasty to mingling with royalty and sharing her faith with world leaders. Drew's hit rock bottom and climbed back out numerous times, including through a difficult divorce and then a very public mess when her son actor Armie Hammer faced serious and extremely bizarre accusations. Drew writes in detail about these difficult times in her book Hammered and shares with us how her faith sustained her during her darkest days. Drew, it's so lovely to get to meet you today, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And wow, thank you so much for, number one, sharing your story of faith and how you've walked through a difficult journey for sure with such grace, and the way that you've come out of it by being able to share the goodness of God in just an even more colorful way, you might say.
Well, I'll tell you what, Jennifer, first of all, thank you for having me. And I know that I know that I know that I could have never made it through everything I've gone through if I didn't have Jesus. And, I always tell people there's two options in life because God gives us a choice. Is when we go through difficult times, we can go through this life with God, and it's still difficult because Jesus had trials. So why would we expect anything different? And we will come through. And I love that saying, you come out with even the smell of smoke on you, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or we have a choice and we can go through this life without God. And I tell women all the time, if it's divorce or anything else, that you still make it through. But I see people that are so eaten up with unforgiveness and bitterness when they, are really betrayed by men or men betrayed by women. And the beauty is we might get through it, but it's so much better to go through it with God, because when it was hard for me to forgive on my own, you can literally cast your cares on Jesus, and he will not only help you get through that, but he'll also give you such a love and compassion for that other person. And then you can move on and live a really happy, fulfilled, amazing life, because bitterness would just destroy people.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful part of your story, and one of those things where I thought about of how, not only were you able to forgive, but the way that it appears that you really were able to kind of dissolve that root of bitterness that was there. And it's our nature to carry that around. But I think my favorite thing that you said about it is the fact that it was the greatest gift that you gave your kids was the fact that you were able to forgive their father so that there was a really healthy relationship that they were able in turn to have with their dad. And then in the end, before your husband passed away, you were able to also repair and have a healthy relationship with your husband.
Oh gosh. Well, because you move on and you have grandchildren.
Mm.
You're sharing grandchildren together. And even if you don't have grandchildren, you still have children and holidays. And I really think that that's one of the most difficult things besides the severed relationship, because God says the two become one. But also, your children have no family to go to over the holidays or any special time or birthdays. I remember so well right after or right when I was going through my divorce. You never know when it's going to hit you. And I was sitting at dinner with my sister and brother-in-law, and this family came in, and they had sons about the same age as our sons, Armie and Victor. And the sons had their spouses because they were in their late 20s, probably early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting there, and they all come in and they were celebrating one of the son's birthdays, and they brought gifts, and they were all sitting there laughing and just enjoying each other and talking about funny things they had done when they were kids and stupid things and laughing about it. And all of a sudden, the birthday cake comes, and they're all singing happy birthday. And I just start bawling because that's
Mm,
the saddest part about divorce is you lose that family unit. You know, that big happy family. And look, I know every family has their own issues. There is no such thing as a perfect family here on this earth yet, as I say. But there, you know, you lose that family unit. So if you can learn to forgive and move on from there and maintain a healthy friendship, if you will, then that's the healing, like you said, Jennifer, for your sons, is to be able to see your parents move on. Because I have friends that their parents got divorced, and for 40 years they couldn't even be in the same room.
oh,
So
yeah.
that doesn't just hurt yourself, it hurts your children and your grandchildren. Because again, there's no family unit, and I wasn't willing to lose that.
Right. And we don't want people to think that it was easy for you. It's not like you were like, "Oh, I'll just forgive all that and move on." I mean, it took work and prayer, and I know
Yes.
journaling is a big part of your story, and it's really kind of how this book
Yes,
evolved.
that's exactly right. I didn't start by writing a book. And I always laugh and say, this is what I love about God. He uses the most least likely people in the world. I just started journaling, and I think journaling is important. If anyone is going through divorce and hearing this, I really believe that journaling is extremely important for several reasons. First of all, when I would go back and read the journal, in my mind, I thought I had forgiven. But then I would go back to my journals. And you know how sometimes you just try to twist that knife just a little bit to kind of show the world that he was wrong and you were right. Well, that's not forgiveness. So
Mm,
when I would go back, I would realize that not only had I not totally forgiven, that God had to work on my heart in certain issues, but also how God performed miracles in my life when I was going through my divorce, and how He would show up even in these little tiny, minute details to show me He was there. And if you don't write them down, you forget. And it's like the
mm,
story of the 10 lepers when only one of them came back to say, "Thank you, Jesus, for healing me." And Jesus says, "Wait a minute. Weren't there 10 of you? Where are the other nine?" And I would look back on my journals and I would go, "My gosh, look what God did here." And He did so many little and big things that I would forget to thank Him for all the things that He had done. You know, the heart is a very complicated thing, and our
mm.
minds get in the way. And, you know, I realized there were so many, even little tiny things that I would harbor unforgiveness. I hate that statement that says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me." You know, you can say such cutting, hurtful things to people and have them say it to you, and it just resonates in your mind. You know, when you lay in bed at night and you have those one-way conversations with yourself as if you were having a conversation with your spouse, and you're answering, well, those conversations never really end up the way you think they should. But
Right.
just little things that the devil uses to really work on your mind to keep you from forgiving.
So true. I want to go back a little bit so that people know some more about your background. You were
Okay.
not born into this privileged high society family that you married into. You actually grew up quite differently, but you had parents who instilled this really deep faith in you that continued to grow as you did experience life. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Well, I always say I grew up not only in the Bible Belt, but in the buckle of the Bible Belt, because it's like the Pentecostal, all the, Oral Roberts and Kenneth Hagin, they were all in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And my parents found Jesus in their 20s because neither of them had really been raised in strong Christian homes. I think they, might have gone to church occasionally, but not anything like I was raised. Thankfully, a group of Christian businessmen led my dad to Christ. And my dad was extremely driven and ended up being successful because I know God blessed my dad's businesses so my dad could be a blessing. Because there's a scripture in the Bible that says we are blessed to be a blessing. And God knows who's going to be givers and who's going to give back. So my dad actually became very successful. He ended up owning banks and developing land, but he was very humble and nobody knew. And we always used to laugh at my dad because he would get the same car every year in the same color, so nobody knew that he was getting a new car. We're like, Dad, we don't think anybody cares if you get a new car. But he was so humble, and he had friends who maybe couldn't afford that, and he never wanted to rub anything in anyone's face. But that's just to say how humble and amazing my parents were. So being raised in this amazing godly family, and my dad was called into a healing ministry because he went to pray for a friend of his that had to have a major surgery, and he was radically healed in the hospital and was checked out the next day. So after that, my dad said, I made a deal with God and said, if you bless my businesses to where I can pay for every dime, and I always want to clarify because I don't think there's anything wrong with taking offerings at church. We're supposed to tithe to our church and, help the widows, the orphans, and ministries. But that was just my dad's way of doing it. He said, God, I want you to bless my businesses so I can go out and pay for every single dime. So right after that, two men came in and bought two of his banks, and he put the money in a foundation, and he continued giving money into his foundation from his businesses. So I had the privilege, Jennifer, and it truly was a privilege, to grow up in a family that never limited God. Because I know a lot of religions today say the miraculous doesn't happen today, all the gifts of the Spirit. Well, I don't have that luxury of believing any of that because I have seen it firsthand. I've seen people walk out of wheelchairs. I've seen blind people receive their sight. So I think one of my platforms, if you will, is I just want to teach people, don't limit God. He's a God of miracles, and he wants to perform miracles in our lives today. And during my divorce and during my ordeal, I saw so many miracles. I mean, miraculous things that could have never happened if it wasn't the Lord.
You talk about the impact that your father had on you when it comes to being bold in your faith. And you are bold in a way that I am somewhat in awe of as a believer. But you have had the opportunity, and as a believer, I believe God placed you in these places specifically.
Right.
But some of the people that you share, and I know these are just stories that you chose because readers would be interested in them. I'm sure there's also plenty of people that you meet at the grocery store or whatever it may
Right.
be. But you've had the opportunity to witness to world leaders and true dignitaries. And of course, I
Right.
loved reading about your interactions with Princess Diana. Tell me a little bit about those types of experiences and the seats at the tables that the Lord has placed you at.
I know. It's so miraculous. Well, I think that's why God had me raised in the family that I was raised in, because my dad, we always laugh because my dad called it 5 at 5, and we would go down to the river at 5 o'clock and we'd run 5 miles together because my dad was always very athletic. And, but when you're in high school or college, you're just like, Dad, really? Because it would take us an hour and a half because he'd have to stop and minister to everyone on the river walk. And, you don't appreciate it as much when you're in high school because you're like, Dad, I have friends I'm going to dinner with in a little bit. Let's get this going. But I just look back and I think, what a miracle that I had the privilege of being raised under a man who had such boldness. And by the way, you do not run a popularity contest when you're bold like that. And I learned that because when I went to LA, when I met Michael and married into the Dr. Armie Hammer family, that's all I ever knew. And I always witnessed to people in college and had Bible studies in my sorority because it was second nature to me. It's all we knew. So all of a sudden, I go out there and I'm thrown in this crazy world. And I think the story you're referring to was the man who was seated next to me. The reason why I love to tell that story is that was a real pinnacle point in my life where God said, it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, you know me, and I want you to be a light in that dark world. So when I first married into the Hammer family, I was intimidated because I went to Oklahoma State University and, country western two-stepped on the weekends, and I wasn't used to that high society. We didn't live that life. We were never going to be debutantes. It's not who my parents were. And I was married in the family, and I remember going to the very first black tie event at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. And I remember walking in going, God, what am I doing there? I mean, I basically got a political science degree at OSU, and I have no idea to this day how the electoral college works. So if that gives you any idea where I'm coming from. And I'm thinking, I'm walking into this room of world leaders, of people that you read about in the Wall Street Journal, the wealthiest of the wealthiest. The women are dripping in jewels. I thought, what in the world am I doing here? What do I have to say to these people? And this elderly man was sitting next to me. And I introduced myself. I'm Drew Hammer. And he goes, oh my gosh, you married Armand's grandson. He's told me all about you. He said, how in the world did you get to and marry into this family being from Tulsa, Oklahoma? And I said, Jesus. And I just started ministering to him that my parents prayed their whole lives for the right godly mates for their 3 daughters. Michael, my husband, came to Jesus. On our 3rd date, I brought him home to Dad. And my dad led him to Christ and led him into the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And, he said, I had a grandmother who was a Russian baroness, and she was a Russian Orthodox, and she used to pray with me. And I always dreamed that I could run away and go live with her because she was safe. And I think it's because he felt the peace of God when he was with her. So when I started sharing Christ with him, he wanted it, and it made sense. So I started sharing all that with this gentleman. And he said, well, may I tell you my story? I said, I'd love to hear your story. He said, my name is James Roosevelt. And my father, when he was campaigning to be president, that he used to campaign on train. And we would go from town to town by train. And my dad would say to me, James, we need to pray and ask God to give us favor with the American people if I'm supposed to be president. And he said we did this every time before we would stop, and my dad would go give his speeches. And he said when my dad was elected president, and he starts crying, tears streaming down his eyes. He said the night that he was elected president, we went into the Oval Office. He said, now, James, we need to thank God for giving us favor. And he's sobbing, and he said, Drew, I haven't thought of that in 50 years. And I said, well, James, it's time for you to rededicate your life to Jesus. And I prayed with him right there at the table. And the Lord spoke to me, Jennifer, immediately. And he said, Drew, he didn't care if you were a blue blood, who your family is, what you came from. He said, you told him about me, and that's why I put you there.
Wow.
So I became very dangerous after that. I'm like, okay, God, let's do this. Where do you want me to go next? I ministered to every Beverly Hills wife that I came in contact with, and very few of them took me up on it, but I sure won a lot of housekeepers to Jesus during that. So they're just as important as anybody else in this life as Princess Di,
Yeah. Did you deal a little bit like most moms would of their kids going, oh my goodness, who's she going to start talking to Jesus about now? Or like, how did the
They
kids
were
deal with that?
mortified. I think they still are. And actually, I asked both my sons to write something, a quote on the back of my book. And Armie's quote basically says, I've heard this stuff my entire life. Now it's your turn.
That's a good way to sum it
So
up,
there
right?
you go. Yeah, there you go.
I love it. And I feel like Armie was so gracious in giving his blessing because I'm sure that mattered to you when you were going to tell a story that was so personal of your own, but also to involve your kids' lives, your two boys. Tell me about their perspective when you said, I really feel like I'm being called to write this book.
Well, I mean, it did take me 10 years.
Right.
And, we don't want to rush into anything, as I say. But I think a lot of it is God wanted my story to come full circle.
Mm.
And I even sent a copy of the book to Michael, my former husband, because obviously he's a huge part of my story. We were married for 25 years. And I sent copies to both my sons. And I said, read this. It's very personal because to me, if you write a book, you've got to give the good, the bad, and the ugly. Don't sugarcoat stuff because people are not going to learn if you sugarcoat and say, oh, we had a couple, bumps in the road, but everything was great. No, everything wasn't great. And I'm not going to be one of these people that walk around. It's like when you go into church and they say, oh, how are you? Great, great. How are you? When you're dying inside.
Mm-hmm.
So I told my sons that I really feel like I'm called to do this because it's not about us. It's about people who are going through the same thing that need to hear. People will fail us in this life, but God will never fail us. And this book isn't about Drew Hammer or being married into the Hammer family. Yes, that's part of my story. But the real truth is we serve a faithful God, and that's why I named it Hammered, because every heart in this life has been hammered. I mean, that's reality, and the bigger the people, the bigger the problems. But there is a loving God who is there waiting for us to turn to him. But I'll tell you what, life is a heck of a lot easier if you decide to serve the Lord because he's faithful. And I just pray that through this book, it's not just a feel good book, because I can certainly make people feel a lot better about themselves because anything that you have to deal with in this life, I've dealt with it. But that's the beauty because it's the faithfulness of how God has brought me through all these situations. And that's what the book is about. So when I sent it to my sons, I said, you're my sons first. God gave you two human beings to me. And if there's anything you do not want said in there, I will absolutely respect you and take it out. Then Armie said, you know what, Mom? It's fair. You told the truth, what happened, and I think you dealt with it very honestly. I wouldn't change one thing.
Wow.
So they were very open about it.
I think that that just speaks so highly of your relationship, which I know hasn't always been roses, but with your boys and particularly with all that Armie has been through, just because
Yes.
his battles have been more public. And
Yes.
I kind of think about that with your story. All of us have gone through something,
Right.
but for you to have to walk those journeys in the public eye, of course, your son as well. Tell me a little bit about that perspective of the difference of what that's been like to feel like you're being judged by friends or that people are talking about your loved ones around you when they don't even know the truth. Like, how did you talk about bitter? How did you deal with some of that part of it in the height of accusations that were public against your son?
Well, we had a pastor at the Malibu Vineyard that had a statement that I think is so beautiful and pertinent for all of us. He said, if you come to your own defense, it's the only defense you're going to have. Let God come to your defense. And it's hard because there were a lot of times when, and I always preface by saying this, Armie was not criminally wrong. He didn't, he did not rape anybody. We actually have emails because there were several women involved. And, it's funny, they all kind of start eating each other, if you will, pardon the pun with the cannibal thing. I did call Armie one day and I go, okay, just level with me. Are there any women out there with limbs missing? I mean, just tell me. Let's talk about this. And, because you never believe as a mother that you would ever read in the newspaper that your son is a cannibal. And
Right.
it was so audacious that I was like, wait, what? But here's what I do think happened is it happened during the whole COVID when people are no longer going to the office. They're trapped in their own homes. They can't get out. They can't go to restaurants. And it was a feeding frenzy. Another pun. Sorry about that. And, it just spiraled out of control. So I always say Armie was not criminally wrong. He was totally exonerated on the rape cases. We even have emails saying, I need you to go forward with a rape accusation, and just trying to destroy him, basically. But God had a plan because he wasn't criminally wrong, he was morally wrong. And Jennifer, I'm a tough mom. I am not the popular mom that is going to say, oh dear, I'm thinking positive thoughts, throw it out to the universe. Oh, heck no. I'm saying, you know what? Armie was on Jimmy Kimmel one time and he goes, oh gosh, my mom's going to hate this story. Well, I called him immediately. You're right. I hate that story and I did not raise you that way. I mean, I'm a tough mom.
Yeah.
Because I raised my children in the ways of the Lord. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. They know what's right, they know what's wrong. And in such a weird way, everything that has happened to us has been the best thing that's ever happened because there are no grandchildren in heaven. There's only children. And we all have to come to our own salvation individually. And even though my kids were raised in a Christian home, I can lead them to water, but I can't make them drink. So it's up to them. So sometimes you have to hit rock bottom and you have to lose everything to really come to what is important in life. And that is what has happened in our family. And I am so grateful to God. And Armie will even say it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I got caught up in the whole Hollywood thing. Women were throwing themselves at me. I was morally wrong, but I never did any of these things I was accused of, but I might have taken advantage. I never forced myself. It was all consensual, but I probably took advantage. So it's been the best thing in the world that's ever happened in a weird way.
Yeah, well, I mean, God will do some things that to get our attention, to
Yeah.
bring us back to Him sometimes that you'd never expect. One
Yeah.
of the things I wrote down that you said in the book, but you said bad influences plus bad choices are a lethal combination. If you just kind of bring this down to surface level of the journey that like my listeners and viewers are, we're all mothering, and that's what we're
Mhm.
trying to surround them and to teach them that who you surround yourself with matters, the choices you make matters, and
Yeah.
together those two things, I thought the way that you put that was really good.
Well, and it's a heady business. Hollywood's heavy, and
Mm,
so few of them really achieve that level of success. And I'm not saying it because it's my son. I'm saying it because we lived in Beverly Hills and we were surrounded by
yeah,
it. And there's so few people. So when you do, the world is your oyster. And you can be on sets where, directors are basically, kowtowing to you, getting you anything you want. Women are throwing themselves at you. It's a very heavy world that I think few people can handle.
yeah, for sure. My son is in the music business, and I can
One,
remember being in a meeting with him with the entertainment attorney that was going to represent him. And, he was so young, but it was just he and I and the attorney. But the attorney said, Connor, you're entering a world where everyone who's going to be surrounded by you from a business aspect is there to say yes to you. And sometimes those
yeah,
aren't good yeses. Worded it much more eloquently than me, but I'll never forget that advice of, people that want to, would be willing to bring you women, to bring you drugs, to bring you, anything that you want in
anything.
this world, in the spotlight. They want to be yes men in your life so that they're at the
That's
top of
right.
your list.
Well,
Yeah.
and you know what I say? They just laugh a little bit harder at your jokes.
Yeah. That's a good way
It's
to put it. Yeah.
constantly humoring you, building you up, and it takes a really humble person to be able to handle that and not have it go to your head.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
that's the beauty of now that Armie has seen this. He said,
Mhm.
Mom, this round, I am going to take more control and I'm going to do the projects that I feel I'm called to do instead of my agents and agencies telling me what you need to take. So, you see it from a different perspective after that.
Yeah. Do you see good doors starting to open for him again?
Well, I'm actually not allowed to talk about it because he says, no,
Sure.
Mom, don't get on a podcast and talk about it. But let's just say I do know he has written an amazing script that kind of emulates what he's been through. You know, how they always start Armie's name with the disgraced actor, Armie Hammer. And I'm like, I'm not justifying him. He was morally wrong, but he didn't do anything different than a lot of other actors have done, with other women, yada, yada, yada. And yet, it's almost impossible to erase what's been said about you. And again, that gets back to sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me. And even in the Bible, it says there are power in our words. With our words, we bless or we curse, we bring life or we bring death. Choose life. And once all this stuff is printed about you, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owen, every single one of them have done these expose shows on Armie saying, wait a minute, there's nothing criminal that he did. There were a couple DMs where he's like, I want to eat your ribs or something stupid. But, first of all, I'm sure there was alcohol involved in these things. But my point is this. I think the Me Too movement can be taken way too far where facts are not checked before they go out and destroy people. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a real problem in our society.
How did you, just a heart level as a mom, how did you deal with the negativity that you had to read those headlines that call him disgraced or, accused him of things that you knew he wasn't guilty of? Like, how did you just as a mom deal with that?
Oh, I remember the first time I saw it. I was in the grocery store and I'm in the line with my cart and I see a magazine with a glamour shot saying, I am married to a monster. And I just thought, oh my gosh, it just completely broke my heart. And again, I'm not saying Armie was perfect and there were infidelities in their marriage. And I know the deep stemmed hurt that causes. But I also don't believe in vindicating things myself and being proactive to destroy that person. So, and I would walk through Park Village in Dallas where I lived at the time, and people would be pointing and whispering about me, and you know what they're doing. But again, are you going to trust God that the truth is going to come out? Or are you going to allow the devil to beat you down and destroy you as well? And I refuse to allow the devil to destroy me or my family because I know that God has a plan for our lives. So you do a lot of praying and you also kind of have to compartmentalize it because if you let it consume you, at that time it was all over the world in papers and trades, and every day there was something new coming out or the same story over and over. I got off of social media. I stopped reading that stuff because it's like putting salt in a wound. And why do you want to continue that? You just have to go, you know what, God, I trust you. I trust you. And I know that the truth is going to come out. And now all these things are coming out, that there were emails traded between, the women, and they were out to destroy him. And there were many lies. There were many exaggerations. Like even in that Hammer documentary, the girl who was in it, who I met, one of them even stayed in my home, and they were puppy dogs around my son. So there was nothing non-consensual. And trust me, and I say in the book, I think the problem was they were younger, they were beautiful, they were influencers. So you can imagine that their followers, tenfold grew. But, there was a picture of a bite mark in an arm, and they proved that bite mark she got off the internet. He never bit her. I mean, it's just crazy town. But again, the truth comes out. You have to say, you know what, God, I trust you. I'm giving it to you. I know the truth will come out. Does it hurt in the meantime? 100%, because Jennifer, as you know, that saying, a mother is as happy as her least happy child.
Yes, I use that phrase all the time. It's
Yes,
so true.
yes, it is. When your child is hurting, you are hurting. And the
Absolutely.
problem is Armie was not in the spiritual mind frame where he was open to me calling him, praying over him,
Right.
giving him words of wisdom from the Bible. He was
Mhm.
not open to that. But that's okay too, because it's our responsibility as a mother to just pray, whether they want those prayers or not. I was praying. I,
You had put such deep-seated roots in him. You knew that it was there. You
yes,
knew the tools he needed, just like the ones you were
yes.
relying on, were actually there for when he needed them.
Well, and by then we've done our part. If you think about it, in the Jewish faith, they are bar mitzvahed at 13. In the biblical days, they were men at 13. So
Wow.
a whole bar mitzvah, the point is, at 13, that's when you have to make your own choice if you're going to believe in the one true God and the direction you're going to take. So we've done our job by the time they're in their late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
It's done. You formed them as much as you can. And again, there's no grandchildren in heaven, only children, and they have to come to it on their own. And
Thank
sometimes it's a very difficult journey to be there. But all that matters is that they get there.
Yeah. There's I don't want to keep you too much longer, but there was one other thing that I thought that you would be such a great person just to ask about this, because these interviews I do, they're about motherhood and the journeys that we walk. And so many of them are about all of the exciting times and the positive things that mothers have gotten to do because their son or daughter has reached like this level of fame. But you also walked through a time of estrangement with your son. And like you said, not being able to speak some of the truths into him that you wanted to. And even though people may not be able to relate with what you guys were going through in the public eye, I do think that there are a lot of moms who watch and listen to my podcast every week that have that estrangement or that not so perfect relationship with their child for a period. How would you encourage those moms that are in that stage with a son or a daughter that they're just hoping returns back to them?
Well, just to start from my personal experience with this is I'm in a prayer group with, Mary Hudson, who is Katy Perry's mom.
Yes.
Patty Bieber's a friend, her son Justin. What people don't realize is when your children become famous, if you will, you lose a lot of the relationship with your child because they're all over the world. I
Mhm.
mean, Armie was filming all over the world, doing red carpets, going into 12 countries. I mean, it's a lot of pull on your children. And, you don't have them every Friday night for a family dinner. It's just the way it is. And really, all you can do is make that effort to seize every moment you can to be with them. And again, in our prayer group, we constantly pray over those kids of ours. And I always tell Armie and Victor, both my sons. Of course, Victor's my rule keeper and he's always followed every rule and always done everything right. But I always tell Armie, I just have one thing I need to say to you. You literally do not have a chance in hell because I'm praying every single day. So I think what you have to do as a mother is you can't look at the circumstances. You have to know that we serve a faithful God. And if He brought us into the fold, He's going to bring our children into the fold too. Because again, if we're praying mothers, they don't have a chance. So you can't look at timelines. I prayed for Armie for 23 years. So it didn't happen overnight.
Right.
And to this day, we're still baby stepping, back. And I see such tremendous growth, but it's not in our timing. Did I want it to happen in a year? Absolutely, I did. But it's not our timing. But you have to believe no matter what circumstance you're seeing, rather, what lifestyle your child is in, we have to know that it's ultimately God that is going to bring our children back. And I'm going to say this too, which will really encourage mothers. is I was just reading a story on C.S. Lewis, and he was so brilliant that they said he could sit in his library and he had thousands of books around him, and someone could pick a book out of the bookshelf and open it up to chapter 8, and he could tell you what's in that chapter. Now that is a brilliant mind, but sometimes brilliance gets in the way, thinking that you don't need God because you're so smart, or you're too smart for God, which is so funny to me, the creator of the universe. But here's what I love, and I want to encourage every single mother on this, is C.S. Lewis started pontificating, if you will, with Tolkien and all these other Christian intellectuals when he was at Oxford. They would meet once a week and talk about the existence of God, not existence of God. He was an atheist. He was a proclaimed atheist. And he said he started researching on his own, not what anybody else was telling them. So we can pray for our kids, but it's about our kids finding it on their own. And he said he was riding in a sidecar of his brother's motorcycle, and he and his brother were going to go to the zoo for the day in England. And he said, when I sat in that sidecar on the way to the zoo, when I sat in it, I was an atheist. By the time I got to the zoo, I believed. Wow. Now that is intervention from the Holy Spirit. And God obviously had a tremendous plan, because I gave mere Christianity to my grandfather-in-law, Dr. Armie Hammer, a 91-year-old Russian Jew, and he read that book, and I bought him the Bible with Isaiah 53, and I outlined everything, and I would talk to him about the Lord, and he came to know Jesus as his Messiah, a 91-year-old Russian Jew. So there's nobody God cannot reach. And if we're praying for our kids, they're going to come in, because that's God's promise to us. But you cannot look at circumstances and how many years or where they are or how dark their life is. Because if C.S. Lewis can get in a sidecar as an atheist, and by the time he got to the zoo, he was a believer, I'm saying we have a chance.
I'd say so. That is great encouragement. I want to make sure people know how they can get the book. It is called Hammered. It's beautiful. The picture of you on the cover is so pretty, and I love all the bright colors and everything.
Thank you.
And I know that it was a labor of love to put it out. So
it certainly was. So you can get it on Amazon. And I also have a brand, and it's called Drewville, because I've renovated 41 properties. And my sons tell people that they grew up in Whoville, because I decorate with hot pinks and lime greens. That's why my cover that's one of my designs on the cover. And you can get it on Drewville, and I have a lot of other products that I believe is inspired by the Lord. And the proceeds go, I set up entities in churches, and I help single women and sometimes single fathers that literally can't buy groceries. So just know that the proceeds are going to help others, and it goes into my foundation, hammeredheart.org, and then I give from there.
I thought the stuff about the home renovations and all the different houses that I really enjoyed that part of it. And I think that is fascinating.
Thank
you have renovated and lived in some of the most beautiful homes in LA to be ever built.
So I hope through that chapter that I can really help women to say, maybe do something on the side just to prepare a little bit. I don't want to put doubt in people's mind that their marriage isn't going to work out, but who knows what's going to happen in this life. Only one we can truly rely on 100%.
Amazing. Well, you do some beautiful ministry work. I love that you're using your platform, and always have, really, in such a positive way. So it was delightful to get to meet you. So thank you so much, Drew.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Drew for taking the time to have this conversation, for being so vulnerable, and for sharing her faith so boldly. You can visit Drew's website at drewville.com. That's where you can purchase her book and see other initiatives that assist women in need. Be sure to follow the podcast, hit subscribe, and share our podcast with your friends. We'll meet you back here next week.